No matter what North Korea provides, Japan is never going to be satisfied. Japan colonized the Korean Peninsula. Anti-Japanese sentiment is stronger in Korea than it is in China. I've always had an interest and sympathy for people who grew up under these communist regimes. As you know, escaping North Korea is very difficult. They run Korean schools that teach the North Korean ideology. His daughters are being groomed to be spies for this regime.
Welcome to Unpacking Japan. I'm Toby, and today we welcome Oliver. Oliver is a researcher at Ritsumeikan University on Japan-North Korean relationship, specifically involving the collaboration between Japan and South Korea over North Korea. And today we're going to talk about all these relationships and how this works. You've contributed to a lot of publications such as The Spectator or NK News, and you have your own Substack where you share a lot of interesting articles. So thank you very much for coming, Oliver.
Oh, it's an honor to be here. A pleasure to be on your program.
And so, as everyone who comes here, first we usually dive a little bit into the background and what brought you to Japan in the first place, and how did you get interested into studying Japan-North Korean relationships?
Yeah, it's a long story, but what got me into Japan specifically, it's probably not that different than most people my age who come here. So I was born in 1997, so I'm 26 years old. So roughly that late millennial, early Zoomer generation. So most people my age grew up with things like anime, manga, video games. But for me specifically, it was actually film that got me into Japan. I've always been a huge fan of cinema, world cinema. And when I was in high school, the films that were the most interesting for me were the Japanese ones. So like Akira Kurosawa, Masaki Kobayashi.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So I just decided to learn Japanese as a hobby. It was just a thing that I did in my spare time while I was doing my normal high school studies. And I did that for about a year. And then when it came time to enter university, I went to the University of Pittsburgh. I'm from Pittsburgh originally. They had a really good Asian studies program with Japanese, Chinese, Korean. So I figured I'd major in Japanese and see where it would take me. And I really worked hard. I was able to get a lot of so I got 3 years worth of classes done in about 2 years. And so by the time I studied in Japan in my third year, I already had a pretty decent grasp of the language. And I was able to stay here for 15 months the first time, so a little much longer than the average study abroad. So when I did that and when I was done with that, I really decided I wanted to make my life here and try to find a living for myself here.
Do you remember the first time you came to Japan and after, studying it in high school and watching all those movies and then you finally get here?
Yeah. So my university had an internship program with a company called Central Glass. It's as the name implies, it's a glass plant. They produce a lot of window panes, glass products, that sort of thing. And I was able to get an internship in Yamaguchi Prefecture in a small town called Ube. It's not really that much well known, but it is the hometown of Yoji Yamada, who's a very famous Japanese film director. Cool. And also the creator of Neon Genesis Evangelion, Ano-san, he also was raised there too. So yeah, that sort of thing really appealed to me as like a film fanatic and like as like a media enthusiast. But the actual work itself was working at this glass plant for 3 months. And because it's the middle of the countryside, there's no English, obviously. Everybody speaks Japanese. It was also the first time I was living on my own. I was 19 at the time. So I learned a lot about just life in Japan. And I'm actually really happy that I did it in the rural part of Japan over the city, because I think it really made me get to know a lot of the people around me better than I think city life would.
Yeah, the first experience especially, right? Because when you get thrown into the big cities, it's chaos. And you also have the high possibility of kind of ending up in this foreigner bubble, right? But in the countryside, you have to just figure things out.
Yeah, and also I would argue that I think it's sometimes easier for a foreigner to get used to Japan in the countryside because it's a more close-knit community, so everybody knows each other. There's greater incentive to get involved in local events and to be a closer part of your company, so that really helped me. But that internship was just for 3 months. So after that, I did a homestay in Kobe. That was for like the rest of the study abroad period. And also in between, I traveled across Japan and went to many different places. I went to Hiroshima, Niigata Island, Niigata Prefecture, then Sado Island, a lot of different places. So I saw a pretty good chunk of Japan the first time I was here. And actually, ironically, I think I've been to more places in Japan than I have in my own country in the US. Because in the US, if you don't have a car, it's very hard to go to any other states. But in Japan, because the public transportation system is so good, it's very easy to go to another prefecture. So I mark down on Google Maps every place I go to. So in Japan, my map, it's like a cluster of all these like yellow stars. But in the US, it's all spread out and very minimal.
Have you done all 47 some prefectures yet?
Not yet, but that's the goal. Eventually, I want to do that. I've been to places like Totoriken, like the really there's
least populated,
the least populated places, but there's usually at least like one or two famous tourist attractions there, like the sand dunes. So, yeah, it's I really like travel, and I really like seeing new parts of Japan. I've been here for about 6 years, so I'm always excited to see new parts of this country.
So you come here and you really kind of find a place you like. You want to stay here. You want to come back. What pushed you to decide to come back to do kind of graduate studies and research at university?
Yeah, well, that ties into my field of North Korea, which I'm sure we'll get into a lot on this program. But I got into North Korea for two reasons. First, I'm half Chinese. My father grew up during the Cultural Revolution. So I've always had an interest and sympathy for people who grew up under these communist regimes. And North Korea is the only country on earth, with maybe Cuba and Venezuela, that's anything like what my father grew up with, though, of course, there's a lot of differences. And then the second part of that is when I came to Japan in 2017, that was at the real height of the missile launches coming from North Korea. So I really wanted to learn more, and I wanted to study this more as a researcher. So it sort of was like a combination of two things. It was the combination of my interest in Japan and my interest in North Korea. And because these two countries actually do have a pretty long history with each other, I thought it would be an interesting field to study.
You're actually until now you have been until now on the MEXT scholarship.
Yes.
I think this is something maybe a lot of people strive as well.
Yeah.
Can you maybe briefly give us an overview of how did you apply? How does it work to get this MEXT scholarship to come and do postgraduate studies here?
Yeah, well, my advice for that, whether it's the MEXT scholarship or any scholarship in Japan, is to apply early. So when I came back from Japan the first time to the U.S., I had 1 year university left to finish. So basically, I had a timeline of 1 year to get everything in order to come back to Japan. So basically, as soon as I went back to the United States, I started looking up scholarships to study here. So MEXT really is, I think, the gold standard for most people. It pays for your entire tuition, and they also even pay for the plane ticket to come here. So that was what I was really aiming for. So the key to getting that is you just have to have a solid research plan, and you need to find a professor who's interested in what you're looking at. And what's interesting in my case is my topic actually greatly changed. Originally, I wanted to research Zainichi Koreans and the ties to North Korea. But so I did like a research plan for that with a professor at Ritsumeikan University, which also has a long history with University of Pittsburgh. So that was a good thing in my favor. And so I wrote a solid research plan about that. But then when I actually came here and I spoke with my professor, we moved to a different topic because he kind of said it was more closer to sociology than international relations. So it took a while, but from there I eventually did Shinzo Abe's policy on North Korea throughout his administration. So that became the subject of my master's thesis. But regardless of what you end up actually writing about or what you end up studying, your research plan is the most important part. So what the people, whether behind MEXT and most scholarship programs, they just want to see that you have some kind of plan and that you have a kind of genuine interest of doing research here. So that's my advice to people who are applying.
And then you apply, and eventually a few months later, you get this little letter. I assume it's a letter, and that gives you the confirmation of you've been admitted to the scholarship program, you're leaving on this day to Japan. Yeah. You arrive here, Ritsumeikan University, you do your master's, and you continue on to your PhD studies, where you are basically in the process of finalizing your thesis or working on it. Do you feel like the approach to research in international relation has been similar here than in the US, which is what you had in your undergrad, or do you feel like the processes, maybe the way people look at the information is different?
Somewhat similar. So at least at the University of Pittsburgh, with the Asian Studies program, we had a capstone project at the end, and that's basically the equivalent of a thesis, but just for the undergrad level. So for my capstone thesis, I looked at the abduction issue, which I think we'll get into later, of North Korea's abductions of Japanese citizens. So the research that went into that was pretty much similar to the research that I'm doing here. I have colleagues who actually have to go to different places to do their actual research, to go on the ground and interview people, a lot of legwork. But mine is mostly just document based and trying to find sources. So most of it can just be done in the comfort of my own room or in a library. And actually, I started I started at the end of 2019, and then as we know, the pandemic hit a few months later at early 2020. So we were really stuck inside for most of this time. But that didn't really affect anything with my research of Shinzo Abe's policy on North Korea. It was just reading as much as you can and assembling all the details together.
So let's get into that a little bit. North Korea and Japan relationships. You've spent many years researching this now, and I want to understand a little bit more where we are today. And I think to do that, maybe we can start a little bit what happened before. And you said that there was a lot of history between the two countries that has led to this. Is there a clear starting point with the relationship between both that can be analyzed and that you're using for your research?
It's really hard because, as most of your viewers will know, Japan colonized the Korean Peninsula, and the Korean Peninsula was part of the Japanese Empire for many decades. But then when World War II ended, North and South Korea were split apart, with the communist Soviets backing the North and the capitalist Americans in the West backing South Korea. So we have these two separate countries now that were established right after World War II, and then the Korean War breaks out where they're both fighting each other.
That was in the early 50s, right? 52, 53?
Yeah, so the Korean War began in 1950, ended in 1953. So throughout this time, Japan is like in a very weird position because it's also being occupied by the U.S. at this point, and that occupation will last for 7 years, from 1945 to 1952. So throughout the Korean War, Japan is a very valuable location for the U.S. military because that's where everything is being replenished, while the ammunition and weapons are being stored. So that happens, and what people don't actually realize is there were a few handful, I think about a few hundred Japanese people that actually did go to the Korean Peninsula and sort of tacitly assisted the Allies in fighting the Communist North. But that's not really discussed that much. It's pretty obscure history. But in any case, Japan was supporting the U.S. during this time, but only very minimal fighting on the ground. But after this, Japan didn't actually establish relations with South Korea until 1965 because Syngman Rhee, who was the president of South Korea at the time, he was very anti-Japanese, and he was really banking on anti-Japanese sentiment to sort of build up his own image as like a Korean nationalist.
Is that a little similar as like Deng Xiaoping did for China when he, after Mao, kind of tried to unify the country and also had this nationalist kind of stance against Japan?
Yeah, somewhat. And I think I would argue that probably anti-Japanese sentiment is stronger in Korea than it is in China. I mean, there's parts of it in both countries, but I think because the entirety of the Korean Peninsula was occupied by Japan for so long and only parts of China were occupied, I think the Korean generation of Koreans, they have more stronger memories of the Japanese than maybe every part of China does. But in any case, they didn't normalize relations until 1965, and that was because of the Cold War, because Syngman Rhee was no longer around, and this was viewed to be as pragmatically beneficial for South Korea. But at the same time with North Korea, Japan also began having an interest in normalizing relations with them too, because as you might know, in 1972, Richard Nixon visited China, and that began the normalization process between the U.S. and China. And then at the same time, Japan also normalized relations with China in 1972. So as the Cold War was going on, there was this pragmatic strategy to become closer with China, to like not make everything escalate out of control. But the problem for Japan was that even though it wanted to have relations with North Korea, and even though there was trade between them, a lot of pressure from South Korea by Park Chung-hee, who was the military dictator leader of South Korea at the time, he was pressuring Japan not to have relations with North Korea. And for the longest time, South Korea's policy was there should only be one legitimate government of the Korean Peninsula, and that's us. So whether Japan has gone through like different stages of like being interested in normalization and being more Western oriented, but in any case, as long as South Korea exists, it's very hard for Japan to have any kind of push towards normalization without South Korea's input or even permission.
But it also seems that the relationship kind of goes a lot through South Korea, but that there are more players involved, right? The US has a strong influence, China also has a strong influence, and it's not just kind of a one-way street or two-way street. Are there throughout the let's say last 50, 60 years of this conflict, let's call it a conflict, key dates, key moments that shaped the evolution of the relationship?
Well, 1965 is the normalization between Japan and South Korea, so that is a very important moment. And then another important moment is from 1959 to 1984, where there was this thing called the repatriation program of Zainichi Koreans that lived in Japan going back to the Korean Peninsula. But what's interesting is that this repatriation program, they all went to the north part of Korea instead of South Korea, because at the time, North Korea, so there's an organization called the Chosen Soren. It's an organization that's basically North Korea's de facto embassy in Japan. They run Korean schools that teach the North Korean ideology, Juche, and Korean language, that sort of thing. And basically, as these Koreans were dealing with either discrimination or difficulties climbing the social ladder in a post-war Japan, you have North Korea, which is promising them free healthcare, free jobs, free housing in this socialist paradise, is what the propaganda was. So tens of thousands of Koreans living in Japan, and also a few thousands of their Japanese spouses, they voluntarily went to North Korea to to search for like a better life. But obviously, the lives for them were horrible. It was standard of living, even by post-war standards. Post-war Japan was in a much better position than North Korea was. And of course, North Korea is an authoritarian country where there's no freedom. So a lot of those people regretted their decisions. But at the same time, they brought with them a lot of money, a lot of consumer goods, and that actually facilitated a lot of trade between North Korea and Japan for a very long time, to the point where a lot of these Koreans that had lived in Japan that were living in North Korea, a lot of them were able to have a relatively better affluent lives because they had these valuable consumer goods and they had Japanese yen with them. But as soon as North Korea over the years, the West has pushed like a sanctions regime on them, that's basically made the economic relationship between Japan and North Korea slow down to a trickle. So at this point, there's very little going on back and forth between them compared to what there was maybe 50, 60 years ago.
Are there any stories of some of these Zainichi Koreans? So for people that don't know, Zainichi Koreans are ethnic Korean people that live in Japan, most of the time maybe even were born here and grew up here, that went back to Korea, North Korea, and then came back to Japan? Are there a few?
Yes, there was. And actually, one of my colleagues, Marcus Bell, he's written a really good book. I believe it's called Outsiders. It's about the history of immigration from Japan to North Korea, and back. And there's also another really good book, The Aquariums of Pyongyang, which is, I think, one of the more famous books about North Korea, where that author is one of those Zainichi Koreans that went to North Korea and then came back to Japan. So only, I think, I would say maybe a few hundred out of those few thousands have been able to escape North Korea. But as you know, escaping North Korea is very difficult. You have to either go through China, Mongolia, multiple countries, and it's a very dangerous journey. And I think, though, at this point, most of the ones that could have escaped have already escaped, because these would be very elderly people. And also, their descendants who went to North Korea, they've already mingled in with the North Korean population. So it's really old history that's been somewhat understudied, but there are more scholars that are trying to get into this field. So it is a very fascinating topic.
A more recent event, and you mentioned that this was a topic of your undergrad research, was the abduction of, I think, 13 people from basically North Korean agents within Japan to bring back to North Korea. And as far as I know, or I read, the idea behind this was they wanted Japanese speakers to teach young North Korean students Japanese, so they could potentially have spies in the future that master the language. Can you explain a little bit what happened, when, and what were the consequences of this?
Yes, so this began in the 1970s on the auspices of Kim Jong Il, who was the son of Kim Il-sung, the first leader of North Korea at the time. And the idea was that North Korean spies would abduct not just Japanese people, but foreign nationals from across the world to bring them to North Korea to teach their own spies language. So they would abduct Japanese people and bring them to North Korea to teach them about Japanese language and culture. Though there is something interesting where, as I mentioned, we have all these people that voluntarily went to North Korea from Japan. So it's been questioned why they would want to get them specifically to come to North Korea. Well, this program, it goes beyond just language and teaching language and culture. They also wanted to breed new spies too. So the idea was that they would abduct people and have them basically force them to marry each other and have children, and then their children would be raised under the North Korean regime. So if you can imagine Eurasian people with Eurasian features, but they speak Korean fluently and they're totally loyal to the regime, they would be the perfect spy to go to other countries. And it sounds like a wild conspiracy theory, and for the longest time it was dismissed as such. But in 2002, Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi met with Kim Jong Il, and Kim Jong Il publicly apologized for abducting these Japanese nationals. And another thing related to that is I actually met Charles Jenkins, who was an American soldier that lived in North Korea for 40 years. He was one of these American soldiers that voluntarily went over to North Korea in the 1960s. In his case, I think he wanted to avoid the Vietnam War draft. But the person he married was actually one of these Japanese abductees. So when she was repatriated back to Japan in 2002 as a result of the summit between Koizumi and Kim, Jenkins and their two children a couple years later also came to Japan as well. So from him, we know a lot about the testimony of what this program was about, and he truly believes that his daughters were being groomed to be spies for this regime, because in his memoir he mentions how when he brought his two daughters to Japan, it took quite a long time for them to kind of unlearn the indoctrination that we're born into. So stories like this, it's really fascinating. It sounds like something straight out like a spy novel.
I want to just dive deeper into this, because I'm very curious. I mean, we hear so much about North Korea, and then sometimes, occasionally, at least maybe before COVID and before the incident of an American student dying basically as a cause of the detention he had in North Korea. some YouTubers or video creators were able to go to North Korea and film things, right?
Yes.
So we've seen certain things, but we know it's all very curated. So what is it like, when someone actually lives there for 40 years?
Yeah, well, he has a very rare experience because besides him, there were a few other American soldiers that went to North Korea. And there's a bit of a misconception. A lot of these people think that they were like communist sympathizers. They went there for ideological reasons. Most of these were just people from very poor backgrounds from the rural South of America where, didn't have really good education. They didn't have many good prospects. They were having disciplinary problems. So in those days, North Korea's the propaganda, the Cold War propaganda would have said North Korea is a scary country. It's a communist dystopia, which is true in many sense. But like these American soldiers wouldn't know any better. They just wanted to like leave their duty. And the idea was if they went to North Korea, they would be taken to an embassy and then sent back to the U.S., which is, a very harebrained scheme in retrospect. But, this is the 1960s. You don't know that much about what's on the other side. So, so basically for the next few decades, these American soldiers, they lived in North Korea. They taught English to spies. A few of them even appeared in a few propaganda films where they played the evil American villains in these movies. So they became sort of these micro celebrities in North Korea. But Charles Jenkins was the only one to actually leave. Two of them died of natural causes. One of them, James Dresnock, who was the subject of a documentary called Crossing the Line. In this documentary, he kind of professes loyalty to the regime. But it's really hard because if you're being filmed in North Korea, of course you're going to say whatever is convenient for you. Of course you're going to say that the regime is a good thing. Whereas Jenkins, because he left North Korea, he had the opportunity to be more honest and to tell the world what he saw and what he experienced. And I met him in August 2017. I went to Sado Island, which is off the coast of Niigata Prefecture. He was working at a history museum for the time. And just 4 months later, he passed away. But I was able to interview him and get his story down. And that became the subject of an article that I later wrote for NK News.
Wow.
Yeah.
You said that for those 13 abductees, Kim Jong Il apologized in 2002 following a meeting with former Prime Minister Koizumi. I read that some of the bodies were repatriated to Japan and DNA tests were conducted, and apparently some of them did not match the DNA of the people, so basically hinting to the fact that North Korea sent just random bodies to Japan.
Well, yeah, that was a huge controversy. There was also a controversy of like how well these samples were actually analyzed. Some believe that they were contaminated when they were being analyzed. But this is a thing where this is why the abduction issue is such a huge quagmire between Japan and North Korea. It seems that no matter what North Korea provides, Japan is never going to be satisfied. But at the same time, we do know that North Korea has lied about many things before. So, you mentioned 13. There could actually be way more than 13, too. The official national Japan's police agency, they report hundreds of missing people. And there's actually a page on their website that says, people that cannot be removed from the possibility of having been abducted to North Korea. But it's so difficult to prove who actually was abducted, who's dead, who's alive, that there may never be actual solution to this. And the other issue is that there probably are still like Japanese people in North Korea that are alive, but if they know too much about the regime, it would be very difficult for North Korea to repatriate them and bring them back here. Because in 2002, there were 5 people that came here. It was only supposed to be a temporary visit where they would see their families for the first time in a few decades and then go back to North Korea. But obviously they didn't do that. After pressure from the Japanese government and their families, they stayed in North Korea. And to get their family members, like Jenkins and their daughters, to come back to Japan.
They stayed in Japan.
These 5, they came to Japan first, and then whatever children they had in North Korea were still in North Korea. So that was a very valuable bargaining chip for North Korea to have. And it was so because they got tons of rice and aid from Japan as a result of these negotiations, and they sent them back to Japan. But since then, there's been no other people repatriated. It's been like this for over 20 years. And in 2014, there was a summit in Stockholm held between the Kim Jong Un government and Japan, where North Korea promised to have more investigations into this, and Japan promised to loosen sanctions in exchange for that. But the issue is that this is also when North Korea was conducting more nuclear tests. So at that point, Japan has no choice but to bring back the sanctions. And then North Korea says, well, if you're going to put the sanctions back, we're suspending our investigation, and this is a solved issue. So it's this back and forth between both countries where it's a stalemate, essentially.
So the abduction issue is still an issue today and is in a stalemate. How has the kind of change of leadership in North Korea affected from Kim Jong Il to Kim Jong Un the relationship? Has there been kind of Kim Jong Un has been educated in Switzerland partly. He's maybe a bit younger. still a dictator, but has this changed in any way?
Yeah, so this is also another misconception that I wish more people would be aware of. The fact that these dictators have like studied in the West, that doesn't mean they're going to be more liberal or more open-minded. And in actually the contrast, I think because they understand how the West thinks and how we view things, that just makes them even more brutal, and it just encourages them to push back against all Western pressure. So even Xi Jinping, he studied in the U.S. for a little bit as well. There's a few pictures of him studying. I think it was in California. So it's interesting seeing how these people look before they became dictators. But no, Kim Jong Un is just as brutal as his father, if not even a bit more so. His sister Kim Yo Jong is also very famous too, and also she takes that also from their father as well. And Kim Jong Un knows that he has to be a brutal dictator for North Korea to still survive. If he loosens up or if he allows more information to come to North Korea, that will be the end of the regime and it will collapse. So a lot of people say, why can't North Korea become like Vietnam or Singapore? It's because if it becomes like that, then the regime will lose its power. Kim Jong Un, at this point, he's trying to have economic stability for as much as can be possible at this current time, but he has no interest in actually liberalizing his country or being friendlier with other countries. So in 2017, 2018, 2019, we saw him trying to shift towards having these summits with South Korea and the United States, but he got nothing out of it because the West doesn't want to reward North Korea for bad behavior. So if we loosen the sanctions, they're still going to continue developing nuclear weapons and these other weapons that are a security risk for the region. But at the same time, I think most policymakers have agreed that denuclearization is a pipe dream and it's very unlikely to happen. So in the next century, probably, we're going to have to learn how to deal with a nuclear North Korea, and what shape that will take, that remains to be seen.
So you have the historical colonization of the Korean Peninsula by Japan, and then you have the Korean War, and then you have a back and forth between the relationships for a while, but then it starts going nowhere. It's shaken up again through abductions. It's back to a stalemate, and now, even after the passing of regime, nothing changes. How do you describe the situation today?
Well, both Abe, Suga, and now Kishida, they've all said they wanted to have a summit with Kim Jong Un to discuss the future of their relations. But I think both sides realize that unless there's some major concessions given on both sides, it's not going to happen. Because as you might remember, Donald Trump walked away from Kim Jong Un at their summit in 2019 in Hanoi, Vietnam. And since then, the relationship between the U.S. and North Korea has also been stagnated. So from North Korea's perspective, they have to wonder what's the point of coming to the table with Japan if the same thing is going to happen. So Japan has been actually very flexible with North Korea. That was the subject of my master's thesis with Shinzo Abe. He did everything from loosening sanctions to increasing sanctions to trying to have summits with North Korea to trying to put pressure on them. But it seems that like nothing has worked. And again, whatever happens going on from now, it has to be a situation where both sides can get something. But also, these are just short-term games we're talking about. If that can actually extend into long-term games, that would be solving a very difficult foreign policy issue. It's a lot like Ukraine and Russia or Israel and Palestine. There's a lot of these situations where both sides probably have to give up something, but both sides aren't willing to give up anything.
Do we know from a Western perspective what is the end game for North Korea? What do they actually want? Or are they also trying to lead other country governments in the dark, kind of without revealing themselves?
I think North Korea's ultimate goal is just survival for the time being. As we opened our conversation with, they're the only country in the world that is still a lot like these communist countries from the 1960s and throughout the Cold War. So what Kim Jong Un wants is for his regime to stay stable and to continue to exist. So there's a lot of questions about who's going to succeed him. He recently unveiled his young daughter out for a lot of these propaganda videos. So some people think that maybe he's kind of grooming his daughter to be a successor. I think we believe that he does have a son, but I think his son is still too young to have actually been brought out yet. So he could also possibly be a successor. There's also the speculation that maybe his sister would also be a successor as well. But this is all, I think, very long-term speculation because he's still very young, and despite his health issues and his obesity, he's still around. So the West is going to have to prepare for North Korea to be around for another few decades. And this previous mentality that North Korea is going to collapse any day, I just don't think it's going to happen. So as I said, we have to probably learn how to live with a nuclear North Korea, maybe some form of arms control, because if we look at it, China is a huge rival to the U.S. and to Japan, to all these other countries. And I think most would agree that China is probably actually a bigger threat than North Korea is just because of how huge of a country it is and what arsenal that it has. But China also has nuclear weapons, and no one's really talking about denuclearizing China because we've accepted that's just not going to happen. So with North Korea, I think it's going to be a similar situation. But at the same time, also keep in mind that 50 years ago, when America was fighting North Vietnam in the Vietnam War, nobody would have thought like 50 years from now, America and Vietnam would be close allies and close friends with each other. So in the next 50 years, you never know what's going to happen. Maybe there'll be some kind of political calculus from North Korea that it'll be worth it to maybe ally with the U.S. over China, and that'll form some kind of new relationship. But we really have no idea. It's still just too early to tell.
So right now, basically, there's no real direct communication, and it's kind of unclear what's happening. But when we live here in Japan, one of the things we see and hear about a lot are the weapons tests from North Korea. So regularly, North Korea fires missiles, which often fly over Hokkaido into the Pacific Ocean, sometimes fall short of Hokkaido and into the Sea of Japan. Can you explain a little bit what is maybe the thinking of North Korea behind those tests?
Yeah, it really can be described as saber rattling. It's to like show these other countries that North Korea is armed and that it has these weapons. But at the same time, I don't think North Korea is, I don't think Kim Jong Un is an idiot or that he's like stupid, that he understands what the risk would be of actually directly attacking Japan. So I think these missile launches are carefully calibrated so that they don't hit anything, that they don't hit any like major cities or any kind of like places where there's a civilian population. But the problem is that they still create all these environmental issues. There's no prior warning given when these missiles are shot. And also at the end of the day, we don't really know like where these missiles will land. So far, no one has been injured or hurt yet, but it all just takes one missile for that to happen. And then, there's a huge international incident between both sides. But I also think most people in Japan have just kind of gotten used to it at this point. It's a lot like South Korea. South Korea's neighbored North Korea, obviously, for decades, and they know that there's a huge security risk right next to them. But I think Japanese people have kind of understood that, well, if worse comes to worse and we're going to be attacked, we have to rely on the JSDF and the U.S. security forces to protect us. So, but that also ties into Japan's own position about like, do we renew Article 9 of the Constitution? Do we have our own offensive forces? So it's tied into these wider geopolitical issues.
But those missile launches are quite frequent. And as you said, it just takes one to misfire or to not go as planned and fall into the ocean or maybe perhaps even fall into the ocean, but fall onto a passing fisher ship. But what is the risk? Like, is there a percentage? Do like military strategists calculate what is the actual chance of this misfiring and hitting Japan?
I think the risk is calculated as low, but recently, I think this was about a year ago, the Japanese government has threatened to shoot down any kind of North Korean projectile that comes into its territory. They've said that, but they've not actually done that. So I think they would only invoke that type of defense or those types of powers if they're 100% sure that the missiles are going to hit somewhere. So it is a bit scary to kind of think that there's really not much that can be done about this, but Japan is only a defensive country. It's not like South Korea. So the difference between Japan and South Korea is that South Korea, in response to these types of threats, they've actually done their own missile tests. They've shot missiles into the air. They've shot artillery. They've shown a lot of military equipment off. That's because South Korea isn't constrained constitutionally by whatever military powers they can have, but Japan is. So the other thing though that Japan is trying to do is invest in more anti-defensive missile defense systems and to protect itself against these projectiles.
One example of this is right now with the conflict in the Middle East with Israel and Palestine. Israel is famous for this Iron Dome, right? This missile defense system. Is Japan installing something like this or considering something like this? Does it have the capacity to actually shoot down? Because Japan is quite long. It's 7,000 kilometers, I think, from Okinawa all the way to the tip of Hokkaido.
Yeah, well, I should also preface this. I'm not
3,000 maybe, sorry.
Yeah, I should preface this I'm not an expert in missile technology. There are plenty of my colleagues at NK News and I think at Ritsumeikan University that would be more well-versed in this than I am. But yeah, no, Japan has seriously put a lot of money into its defensive programs. I'm not sure if Iron Dome could specifically work here just because of the shape of Japan. But they recently increased the defense spending of 1% of the GDP to 2%, and that's that's twice as much. 2% might not sound like a lot, but for Japan, it is. And they're really doing that within these restraints of the Constitution. And Abe really tried hard to push for to revise Article 9 of the Constitution, which prevents Japan from declaring war or from having its own offensive military powers. But within those constraints, they're increasing defense spending, and also they're looking into what's called first strike capability, where if it's calculated that North Korea or any enemy country might shoot anything at Japan, Japan can attack first as a form of defense. But that's also a huge its own quagmire, and that could lead to war. But this is all theoretical for the time being.
If we stay in a theoretical, what would actually happen if a missile were to hit Japan and let's say there are civilian casualties?
if there's civilian casualties, I actually think that North Korea would probably do what it can to avoid war, because it knows that if it went to war with Japan, it would lose, because it has the support of the U.S. and South Korea, and even China would be, I think, very apprehensive of getting involved. So. Actually, probably the similar thing is the Yeonmi Park island shelling, where like North Korea actually did shell some island in South Korean territory, and a few people were killed. But everybody thought that could lead to another war, but it really didn't. So there were a lot of apologies given, and a lot of threats. But I think the cooler heads were able to prevail, and they were able to avoid a war. So that, I think, would be the first line of defense.
So it's a little bit like they want to flex their muscle, but everyone still wants to avoid war on both sides. One side wants to kind of preserve its regime, and the other side wants to just preserve its society and the way it's living. But another consequences of all those missile launches is what we see as citizens in the media, right? Mm-hmm. It's being shared widely on Twitter. We get alerts like, oh, be careful, missiles flying over this area. There are sometimes even encouragements, invitations to go to shelters.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is this fear-mongering? Is this something that people should practice? What is going on with the media?
Well, I don't think drills are a bad thing. I think that's always a good policy to have, where South Korea has them all the time too, of what would be the worst case scenario if there was an actually attack on the mainland. But the downside of that is we saw in 2017 where the people of Hawaii thought that they were actually being shot at by like an actual missile, and that everything was going to end. So that was also the fault of the people involved, where it was really poorly miscommunicated. It was an error that's sent out. So things like that, as long as the systems are in place and they're well calibrated, and that mistakes like that aren't made, I can see the benefit of doing that. But in terms of fear-mongering, I think for the Western perspective, you don't live here, it makes it sound like that Japan is like on the verge of going to war with North Korea or China any minute. But people who actually do live here like us, we know that's not the case. We know that like the risk is pretty low. So that is part of it, but it's just one of those things where with like most geopolitical issues, you just have to do the research and you have to look into it as much as you can. And one of the things that I do try to do with my writing, whether it's on Twitter or with my Substack, is try to correct misinformation around Japan and around North Korea. Unfortunately, I think with North Korea, it's been a really thing for the past like few decades. There's been so many fake news stories coming out of North Korea. It's very easy to do because it's a very secretive country where we don't know that much about it. And it seems like if they've abducted Japanese people and if they've abducted film directors and actors, then surely they can do anything. So it's very easy to believe that stuff. But I would still encourage people watching this program to do their research and to really think deeply if like something seems actually right or wrong, and to actually do the research.
Are there any places you recommend where, obviously Twitter is not the place maybe to go look for the latest news because of the high chance of it being fake, but where can you go to find reliable information that's been maybe peer-checked, peer-reviewed, and researched properly?
Yeah, well, this is kind of self-promotion, but I would say NK News, which is one of the people that one of the organizations that I've written for. And so I joined them because they're a site that's specifically dedicated to news just on the Korean Peninsula. And so whenever we have any kind of reporting from North Korea, we need at least 2 sources to check that out to verify that it's true. We do in-depth analysis of these missile launches, and we also do risk perception. The group is called Korea Risk Group, so it's all about what's the risk of North Korea on people's businesses and academic institutions, that sort of thing. So I think the only downside is that it is a paid model. That type of analysis doesn't come cheap, and so there is an incentive for people to subscribe to that. But it's been a very successful model. I'm good friends with Chad O'Carroll, who's the founder of NK News, and even though North Korea is not always in the headlines all the time, he's somehow been able to make it where this is a sustainable operation, and we're completely run on paid subscribers. We don't have any ads. We don't have any government funding. So that allows things to stay a bit more neutral. And we've been quoted in many different outlets too.
Is there any common and recurring type of misinformation that you see where it's like, I don't know, every few weeks or every few months, the same kind of story that makes it into social media that is wrong?
I think it's stuff like treating Kim Jong Un sort of like a James Bond villain, where in some sense he is, because he does live some of like a lavish lifestyle. But there's like a pretty famous story where like he like fed his uncle to the dogs because like his like uncle spoke out against him. But the thing is that's half true. So like his uncle was executed by Kim Jong Un, but it was just by a normal firing squad. He wasn't actually fed to the dogs in some kind of brutal fashion like that. And that just came from a parody site. And because that parody site was widely reported, it was turned into fact. So anything to do with like the Kims of like some like outlandish story like that, most of the time it's probably not true. Or if it is true, there's like parts of that are true, and then the rest has sort of been like filled in with the blanks. But I also kind of noticed this happens with a lot with Japan as well. As somebody like who actually lives here, how the Western media covers Japan and how a lot of people who don't live here cover this country, it seems to fall into very similar pitfalls of just theatrics and of something like, try to make this country look really weird and foreign compared to the West. So not just with North Korea, but with Japan, I also try to correct that misinformation as well.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because the news circulates very fast and it's a 24-hour news cycle. And well, thank you for putting a lot of effort into trying to share the right information. I want to get into one more topic, which at the very beginning, we started a little bit talking about the repatriation of Korean citizens or kind of ethnic Zainichi Koreans from Japan to North Korea. But there are still North Korean communities in Japan. And if I'm not mistaken, there is a North Korean school in Osaka.
Yes.
Do you know a little bit about this?
Well, so that ties back to the Chosen Soden, which runs these Korean schools. So it's not just in Osaka, it's throughout the country. There are elementary, middle, and high schools that are all taught in Korean, and they teach them about the North Korean ideology. And I wanted that to be the subject of my master's thesis, but again, because it's more closer to sociology, I kind of shifted focus. But I've always had an interest in that because it's fascinating that these communities are still able to survive, and they are very controversial though, because a lot of Japanese people, because again, if North Korea is kidnapping our citizens, why do we have schools in Japan that are teaching people about this ideology? But it's complicated. So like Koreans have had a very long history in Japan, and there's a lot of sense of community among them. So a lot of those schools exist because they want to like preserve that history and preserve that culture. The issue is that like after World War II, it was really the North Korea side that was more gung-ho in trying to promote that among Koreans in Japan over the South side. There is a South Korean organization called Mindan, which represents South Korean interests and South Korean groups. But the Chosen Soden is definitely much more stronger and much more influential. But the other difference, though, is that a lot of these Koreans that go through these schools, they come out not really as like indoctrinated communists or loyal to the regime because they live in Japan. They see what capitalism is around them, and especially until recently, about a few maybe 10 years ago, there were like ferries that would regularly like ferry people from Japan to North Korea through these schools. And often what happened was as soon as these students went to North Korea and they saw how much more impoverished it was compared to Japan, that just recently told them like Japan is better and like I'd rather be in Japanese society than North Korean society.
How are those schools kind of allowed in Japan? Mm-hmm. Just because of the long conflict and the lack of communication between both countries and the clear kind of different ideologies. Mm-hmm. Why are those schools kind of allowed to promote this North Korean regime?
Well, that's because they're a private organization. So Japan, I think out of all of Asia, is probably the freest country in terms of like democracy and free expression. So you can have in Japan far right groups and far left groups. As long as they're not promoting terrorism or involved in like illegal activity, they can still be allowed to exist. But with the those Korean schools, there's definitely been more of a crackdown from police and from governments to see how are they being funded? Is like any money that's coming in from outside sources, are they violating sanctions? What is actually like being taught and everything. But as long as like there's as long as everything is like above board, that they're able to exist. But the other issue of this is like it can go into discrimination as well. Mm-hmm. So the Korean side will basically say that any pressure on us is just anti-Korean discrimination from the Japanese government. But obviously the truth is more nuanced. It's more in between, and it's one of those complicated issues. There's no really an easy solution.
So a lot of this happens on a political sphere, yes. Right? It's international relations, what you're studying. It's governments arguing back and forth, negotiating back and forth. What about the people themselves? Mm-hmm. Have you had the opportunity to talk maybe to some of those North Korean descendants living here, mm-hmm. what they're thinking, and perhaps maybe interview their Japanese counterparts?
Yeah, no, I've been very lucky through my research into like what I've been doing to meet many North Korean defectors, to meet people who work at embassies, to meet all these very elite researchers. And I have met a few defectors, and I've also met a few people that have gone through the schools here. And the people who have gone through the schools here, they seem to be pretty normal. They seem to understand that like what they were taught was the pro-North curriculum. But again, because they live in Japan, they're able to see everything around them and to come to their own conclusions. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people who don't buy into it. There are people who believe in this stuff. And there's some Koreans in Japan that definitely feel much closer to their Korean identity than to their Japanese identity. But it's really going to vary from person to person. And I guess the other thing, too, is that coming from somebody who lived under the Cultural Revolution, I have sympathy for these people who live under these regimes. Whatever problems that our governments may have with each other, that's just a political issue. From an individual basis, it's just going to vary from person to person.
Those defectors, do they all share similar stories of how life is like in North Korea?
Some do, but it just depends on really where they grew up. So the ones that were like in Pyongyang, who are like the sons of elites and everything, that had a much better life than people like from the countryside, who were probably, so usually it's not always true, but usually the pattern is if you're living in the rural areas and you leave North Korea, it's just because you don't have anything to eat or you're trying to find work in China, and so you just escape, and then you end up in situations where you can't go back, so you just move away. Whereas people who live in Pyongyang and like these more well-off areas, that tends to be more ideological, or if you did something wrong that maybe displeased the regime, then you have the incentive to leave. So there's many stories of like people who work in embassies that North Korea has throughout the world, where they see these foreign cultures around them, they realize that it's more free to be in England, for example, than to be in North Korea. So they do a whole operation to like get their families out and to try to defect en masse. But the one thing that I kind of dislike about this as well is that, so you probably heard of Yeonmi Park, who's one of the more famous.
I believe I read the book even.
Yeah. So with her, to the positive with her, she's really brought a lot of attention to North Korean issues that I think otherwise wouldn't be there from people who don't follow this topic. But on the other hand, I think she's gotten involved in a lot of politics that turning this into a culture war issue. And I don't think that human rights with North Koreans or any people, for that example, should be a political issue. We should, whether you're left-leaning or right-leaning or center, I think we can all agree that North Korea is a very despotic place. It's a very horrible place to live. And anybody who's been lucky enough to escape from that country, I think we should listen to them and hear their perspectives, but we shouldn't turn this into some culture war issue, because with Park in particular, she's really aligned with more of the, I think, right-wing American politics. And if you're on that side of the aisle, that's fine. But if you're not on that side of the aisle, you'll probably be more inclined to doubt what she says, and that throws the whole thing into question. And this happens all the time, where there's a lot of North Korean defectors where they feel compelled to join more of the right-wing side of politics in South Korea or America, because those are the only side that will actually give them attention, whereas the left-wing side will ignore or downplay the North Korean atrocities or the issues with that regime. So I kind of dislike how it's become politicized, but from the perspective of people that have just escaped North Korea and they need to find a place to live, they need to make a living, I understand why they would pivot towards one side or the other.
I want to tie this now back up to your research that you're doing at Ritsumeikan University. How is it like to study such a sensitive topic that is where there's clear, there's an agenda also on the Japanese side, generally speaking, but as a researcher in a university or research context, you are to be neutral, I believe. Yeah. How does this work? Is it easy? Do you find that maybe because you're studying this in Japan, there is maybe more information that kind of support a Japanese perspective on the matter rather than something just purely analytical and data-based?
Yeah, well, I do want to say, like, first off, being funded by NEXT, which is the Japanese government, they are paying me to do research, and, you know, that has to be disclosed. And I understand why, like, some people say, well, if you're receiving money from the Japanese government, obviously you'll be more inclined to be positive towards the Japanese government. And in one sense, I am very grateful for what they've been able to provide me. I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing without that scholarship. And so I'm nothing but thankful for that. But at the same time, as like a researcher, I try my best to be fair to both sides, whether that's the North Korean government or the Japanese government or the South Korean government. Obviously, we all have our own biases and we have our own political leanings, but I try my best to like look at this and to, whenever I criticize like an entity, it's nuanced criticism and it's not just coming from like a place of anger or displeasure. So that's something that I think a lot of people who research anything struggle with, but it's something that we all, I think, should work on as researchers. But in terms of what benefits of being in Japan, being in the same time zone as the missile launches, that's very good because you can get that information in real time. Having a huge access to Japanese language materials is also very good, and also being able to talk to Japanese researchers and experts who are in this country. I've been able to meet a lot of people both in Japan and South Korea just because of close proximity, and that's really helped my research.
With all this information that you've gathered in the years you spent kind of looking into this topic, do you see, now purely hypothetical and maybe in your own views, a way where the whole situation somehow unlocks and kind of resolves itself? The conflict ends and the war officially ends? Yeah,
well, if that happens, I'll wait for my Nobel Peace Prize then. But, well, no, I mean, my role as a researcher is I kind of just want to explain things of what the situation is to people who are especially outside of this part of the world. So one of my goals is to continue into academia, when I'm done with my PhD, probably move on to a postdoc and then maybe an assistant professor, that kind of teaching position. I would like to really just teach people about like what North Korea is and why these issues exist. And I eventually want to write a book or a series of books just about the history of Japan and the Korean Peninsula, because it's often asked by people like Americans or Europeans or just foreigners in general, why do Japan and Korea seemingly hate each other? But it's more complicated than that. There are times where like there's moments of close cooperation, there are moments of rivalry, there's moments of mutual dislike, and there's moments of really good cultural exchange. So it's all these factors put together that I kind of want to explain to people who live outside of this part of the world.
You haven't written a book yet, but you're writing a lot
Yes.
on your Substack and on other publications. Do you notice what kind of topics are particularly interesting for people that get a lot of engagement, where you get discussion started on the topic?
Yeah, so my Substack is called Foreign Perspectives. I started it last year. And as the title implies, it's trying to show people a bunch of different things that they might have not otherwise thought about. But especially the articles about Japan have really been helpful, I think, for people, for my readers. They really tell me that it's like made them learn more about this country in a way that they probably wouldn't learn from other publications. I've talked about everything from just adjusting to life here to dating and marriage in Japan. I've done some travelogue articles showing lesser visited parts of this country. So stuff like that tends to get a lot of views and it gets a lot of attention. But also the other goal is like I want to kind of bring a bit more of a nuanced perspective about how we discuss Japan. So a couple months ago, both Jimmy Kimmel and Ben Shapiro weighed in on about Japan. And there were some grains of truth of what they both said from a left-wing and a right-wing perspective, but also parts that they got wrong. So this article was just about what they got wrong and how things are more nuanced and more complicated than what a lot of people in the West seem to think it is.
Can you tell us more about this? I think I saw this. It went quite viral, this story between these two prominent American TV personalities or online personalities discussing the topic. Can you summarize it a little bit?
Yeah, so Jimmy Kimmel and his family, they visited Japan and basically was like waxing the praise of how clean Japan was and how tidy and orderly everything was. Whereas I think Ben Shapiro kind of like, most of the right wing in response to this saying it's because Japan has low immigrants, no diversity, that sort of thing. And I think there's like again, there's a kind of a grain of truth between both sides. So yes, I think Japan is a clean country and it is much cleaner than a lot of other societies. But Jimmy Kimmel was mostly visiting the tourist attractions and like the places that like are catered towards tourists. So for his perspective, I think it would have been a very enjoyable experience. But when it comes to actually living here, like and adapting here, you have to really learn the language and you have to learn how to like respect the cultural values and all of that. And for somebody who Jimmy Kimmel is much more left wing than Ben Shapiro is, he probably believes more in, I guess, diversity, multiple cultures mixing together, but it's much harder to do that here. But then Ben Shapiro, on the other hand, he's saying that's because Japan takes in no immigrants at all. There's like no diversity at all. But that's not necessarily true either. There are an increase of immigrants coming to Japan, and they do bring their ideas here. And it is possible to adapt to this society. It's just that the standards are different from the West. So again, there's parts that both of them were saying that were correct, but also not the full picture in general.
When stories like this blow up in the West and they talk about Japan, usually they get picked up on Japanese social media as well,
Yes.
right? What was the reaction here?
I don't think there really was that much of a reaction, though. I think some of what maybe Ben Shapiro, I don't think didn't go viral at all, but Jimmy Kimmel did, and I think it was just most Japanese people were like happy to hear that like a celebrity was praising them. But there's the whole thing though, where it's like, the reason that I think I agree with the right in one sense is where they're criticizing Jimmy Kimmel for saying like the policies that you want won't let this happen in Japan. So, for example, New York, San Francisco, like LA, these very liberal cities, they have way more trash and they have like way more issues with like poverty and drugs, and they would say it's because like the policies there are too liberal, whereas in Japan the policies are much stricter, and that doesn't that allows for like things to be a bit better. But somebody like Jimmy Kimmel, for example, wouldn't want those policies.
So it goes to show how complex some of these issues can become.
Yes.
And when they're being discussed online, some small clips can
Yes.
lead to a lot of misinformation, a lot of
Yes, and this is the other thing too. So like when people like Ben Shapiro mentioned that, I agree with that, like, in some parts, but they also say things that like Japan has no immigrants or that there's like no influence at all from the outside, and that's not true either. And I wrote a piece for The Spectator about why I don't think Japan will repeat the same mistakes of immigration that the West has, where I think Japan has seen the importance of and the need for immigrants, of skilled workers to come into this country, but they're very cautious about just letting in so many people in mass, them not speaking Japanese, not adapting to the culture. So they want to basically look at like what are the benefits of immigration and what are the negatives of immigration, and what can we do to sort of like address these negatives and make it more applicable to Japanese society.
And in traditional Japanese fashion, they will take their time to do the research, to observe what others are doing before they come to a conclusion.
Yeah, so you might remember how like 10 years ago, roughly, already, the Syrian war crisis, there was a lot of pressure from Western countries to take in Syrian immigrants and just immigrants from the Middle East in general. And whether you're very pro-immigration or anti-immigration, I don't think anybody can deny that caused a lot of problems in Western Europe of just cultures mixing together and societal tensions between these both sides. Whereas Japan, it didn't take in almost any refugees, and it was very cautious about letting in immigrants. And Japan so far has not faced the same problems or the same cultural issues that immigrants have caused. So I think what Japan will probably do is it will increase immigration as it has already for the past 20 years, but it's going to keep the numbers very manageable, and it's going to make sure that the people who do come here have the skills that can benefit Japanese society. Every 5 years they have like a work program where they invite skilled people from neighboring countries to come here. But to come here, you have to speak Japanese, you have to pass a skills test, and you have to have the relevant qualifications for the field you want to get into. So I think those are very good bulwarks for a sensible immigration policy.
We covered a lot of topics today, from your journey to Japan, your research, and basically a little bit of the history of the Japan-North Korean relationships and the consequences today, where we at, where the future might be. Is there anything important about this relationship between North Korea and Japan that people should know, people should pay attention to, that we haven't covered or we haven't touched upon?
I would say that I think in some senses Japan kind of feels like a tertiary player to South Korea and to the US because as we remember from a few years ago, these summits were mostly just focused on South Korea and the United States, whereas Japan didn't hold its summit with North Korea. But again, when we're talking about just with the immigration issue, Japan takes its time with looking at the situation. I think Japan was skeptical that these summits, they were whatever result they would produce. So I think because they saw that these summits didn't produce any tangible results, that's why Japan didn't go to the negotiating table. But they're open to having that if those results can happen. So I think that out of like the three players like in this region, Japan takes the most cautious approach. It takes its time with like looking at the situation. And I think what people outside of this region should know is that it's a very important ally for the United States, and U.S. Military forces being in this country, that's a very big important security bulwark, and that's a big part of like keeping stability in this region.
Oliver, thank you very much for coming and for sharing so much. For people that are interested in your work, they can check Foreign Perspectives on Substack. We will link everything in the description, and some of you writing for The Spectator or NK News. This was super interesting, and I think we could go into more depth into all of those topics. And I think for everyone who listened to this and got curious, maybe don't be too quick to make any judgment, but do additional research. I think that's one of the key learnings from today, because it's very difficult to cover everything in 1 hour and to really give the full facts, the full context, and the full historical timeline. But thank you very much for making time and sharing.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you everyone for watching and listening this week's episode. This was Unpacking Japan, and we will be back next week. Bye. Are you looking for another podcast episode to listen to next? If you like the one you just listened to, I'm sure you'll also enjoy the one that I've selected and linked in the description down below. Go check it out.